Morning, everybody. I know you've had an exciting week. Yeah, I am always impressed to see this many people want to talk about finance. I know the breakfast helps, so it's all good, all good. My name's Mel. I work for Big Society Capital. Usually ask people if anybody has heard of us. Not always particularly relevant, but I'll at least tell you for the context of today, which is that we are the world's first wholesale social investment organisation. Basically, there was a piece of legislation that was passed which meant that dormant bank account money could be put to work. And so it's that capital that we are one of the main suppliers of finance to social investors who are able to onward lend that money. I work in the social sector engagement team, and basically my role is to work across the UK, talking to social enterprises and charities what social investment is, what it isn't, when it might work, and trying to bust some of those myths, and also take away some of the fear and the edge about, you know, the risk of taking on debt or having to pay back money with interest. And we've come a long way, I think, in that time. So today's conversation is going to be all around impact investment in place. I'm going to give you set some short context. We're going to hear from all of our esteemed panel members, who I'm going to introduce to you shortly. I've posed a question, a statement and a question to each of the panel members, so I can make sure that we cover a wide range of discussion. And I'm going to allow them all to respond. I'm quite strict, aren't I? So if you don't keep to time, I will be giving you the flag, because what we're really hoping to do is to have plenty of questions from the audience that we can respond to. If you haven't got one, be prepared. I know Sarah's flagged some, and I've got some for those of you that are probably sitting there thinking she's going to ask me a question, isn't she? Probably. So be prepared. And then we're going to move over, as I say, after Q&A, I'm going to come back to the panel, and they're going to just summarise with one thing that they want to leave you with, and then we're going to hopefully have a little bit more time for networking, depending on how lively you all get. So let me start by introducing our panel. Always get some, we get concerned when they talk about exciting with regards to social investment, but you never know. We could try to do that, couldn't we, with any kind of investment? So let's start with Claire Spencer on my far right. Claire currently working at West Midlands Combined Authority and has been assisting and working with us on the Social Economy Task Force and is leading on all things inclusive growth. Yeah. But I know that Claire has a wide and varied history in terms of in this sector, starting with Community Renewables Organisation. Yeah, passionate about Kathy over there. Passionate about community and place, and also served as an elected councillor. Indeed. Welcome. This on my right, Joel and I known each other for some time now. I feel actually we have a very esteemed panel. If you haven't got an award actually in here or recognised, you're not doing so good. But anyway, here we go. I have Joel Blake, OBE, to my right, for his services to business and enterprise support. I know Joel's done, again, and like Claire actually, it seems to be quite a theme here of people that have done a wide range of things, from starting several of his own social enterprises, running lots of chairing forums, sub club, and working around a number of these things. But most recently, heading up the access to business and business growth aspects of the Greater Birmingham Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership. Welcome, Joel. To my left, another award winner, we have Grace England from Resonance, who is investment manager for Resonance's West Midlands SITR fund, and who was recently highlighted in the WISE 100, which is the Women in Social Enterprise 100 Spotlight Award, which she definitely deserves. And Grace is responsible for over £2 million worth of investments, and she's going to tell you more about Resonance's Social Investment Fund and how it uses social investment tax relief. And you're also responsible for the Angel Investor Network at Resonance.
Yes.
Great. Moving swiftly along to Councillor John Cotton, first Labour councillor in 1999, councillor for Glebe Farm and Tile Cross. I nearly got that the wrong way round then. I nearly made Glebe Cross and Tile Farm. Maybe that was everything. And your portfolio includes equalities and community inclusion, and there's one other.
Community safety.
Community safety, that's right. But again, you've got a wide sort of range of experience, private sector, third sector, school governor like me. We'll have to chat about school finances later. We can do that. And last, but by no means least, coming to Steve. I said in my a bit of a brief, I didn't want to say been around the block, but we've been here for a while, haven't we? You can't can't be new kids on the block anymore, I'm afraid, over here. But Steve is Chief Executive at Aston Business Loans, and he has worked in the access to finance sector for a long time. I'm sure he's going to share some of that history with us. And again, I'm sure Steve very proud to have been won his award in 2018 as City Microfinance Responsible Finance Leader of the Year. So there we are. You see, esteemed colleagues, lots of experience. By comparison, I'm not sure what I know, but anyway, I'm at least going to try and keep them on track. So let's just give you a couple of minutes context around impact investment for place. It seems to be the word on the street at the moment. Everybody wants to talk about investment in place. And I suppose the challenge is, what do we actually mean by investment in place? Because that can include a whole range of things, from investment in communities to building social capital, to repayable finance, to contracting for social value. You know, investment could come in a whole range of different ways. And I suppose that even though we're actually going to talk predominantly about finance and that level of investment, actually we must remember that the only reason that anybody would ever make an investment is, in our world, is to create impact. And so it isn't social investment or repayable finance for its sake. It is there because it's a tool to create impact. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with some questions, and let's see how we can bring everybody into the discussion. So should we start off with you, John? Is that okay? Yeah? So place is something that clearly all elected members are passionate about, otherwise I presume that you wouldn't want to do the thing that you do. And your portfolio speaks to the role of communities in our social fabric, and I think this is something that Joel and I have spent a lot of time talking about, in terms of you can't have economic growth, or you shouldn't have economic growth without social inclusive growth as well. So there are a whole host of opportunities linked to forthcoming opportunities in this particular area, like HS2 and the Commonwealth Games, for example. And the local authority and other bodies like the Police and Crime Commissioner investing directly into impact investment funds, or could provide capacity building support directly, or through programmes like Pinch, for instance. I can see Austin here, something that Birmingham City Council have done, or incentivising and raising awareness of retail investment opportunities like crowdfunding match schemes. There's a whole range of ways that the authorities can get involved. So, question for you is, how can we use social investment to maximise these chances to create hotspots for regeneration and to really build on Birmingham as a social enterprise city?
Okay, thank you. You very kindly reminded me that it's 20 years in May since I first joined the City Council, and I've now been a resident of Birmingham for 46 years. So I suppose a bit of context to sort of start with is, if we look at what is it we're trying to affect and change in Birmingham, and I think we've really got what I'd describe as a tale of two cities. The one city is the city that you see outside of that window this morning, which is the cranes in the sky, lots of investment coming in, really flourishing in an economic sense. But the other city that we're looking at is a pattern of entrenched inequality that hasn't changed for many years. I mean, I'd argue that the neighbourhoods where you're less likely to be in employment, where you're more likely to die sooner than your neighbours, but where there's less educational attainment, they were the same neighbourhoods you'd have been looking at on a map 25, 30 years ago. So we've got a deeply entrenched pattern of inequality. And one of the things that we need to really answer here is, why have we failed to connect the one city to the other? Why have we not created a situation where people who are trapped in those situations of inequality have been able to benefit from the growth and expansion that we see in other parts of the city? And I think they're tough questions to answer, and they're certainly not new ones if you think of the years we've been trying to answer them. And also that the questions that we've not answered, despite the fact that we've had many years of well-resourced and certainly well-intentioned initiatives that have tried to transform that situation. And of course the gradient of that hill is now even steeper because of what we've seen with austerity over the last few years. I think part of the answer to that lies in is the traditional approach that we've taken to regenerating place, which has tended to not really work with communities, not tended to value existing assets, whether that's people, whether that's social networks. We've not developed a shared sense of what priorities were for the locality. And we've been too focused on fixing the immediate crisis rather than going back upstream and saying, how do we prevent these issues from emerging in the first place? And certainly part of the problem has been there's been no long-term plan for sustainability and giving community ownership of some of these issues as well. And I think any future place-based investment has to avoid those mistakes if it's going to really be successful and really transform outcomes for people. And I also think in the context of this conversation, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. I mean, it's a very sizable elephant, which is called austerity. If you look at the impact of austerity on the public sector resources in this city over the last decade, the City Council has lost £750 million from its budget. You don't get £750 million out of a budget by ordering cheaper paper clips and toilet roll. This has had a fundamental effect on what we can do. And that's sat alongside similar cuts that we've seen in other parts of the public sector, whether it's the NHS, whether it's the police, and the knock-on effect that's then had on the third sector and the community sector has been absolutely fundamental. So I think that does mean that we need a very different, very more creative approach to doing this. Part of this has to be about, and I see Fran from Claire's sat in the audience there, about how we maximise the impact of the remaining public pound that we have. So, you know, how are we using the public pound in a creative way, joining up what we're doing across sectors, but then using it to drive some proper social outcomes. So in Birmingham, one of the things we did early on was adopt the Birmingham living wage and try to drive that out through our procurement arrangements, try and get some additional social value out of what we're procuring. We're saying to other partners, how do you do that as well? And how do we use that then to grow local supply chains, local business, local social enterprise in a more creative way, rather than leaking the money out to the big companies that have no stake in what's happening in the city. And clearly we've also got to then look at how we bring together other streams, whether that's philanthropic, I'll get my teeth back in, it's early morning, philanthropic capital, whether that's private sector investment, whether that's the kind of social finance options, bonds and other such approaches. I think, well, I'm very keen to explore this further this morning. Some of this also raises some very interesting questions around governance and accountability to communities, and some issues around investment ethics, which I think we need to perhaps unpack a little bit further. And we've also got, as you referred to in the introduction, some major opportunities emerging in this city, particularly with regard to HS2 and the Commonwealth Games in 2022. Commonwealth Games in particular is a major opportunity, I think, for the city if we get this right. You know, for every £1 that we're putting in locally, £3 of government investments coming in, then there's everything else that will come in on the back in terms of private investment. But what we can't afford to happen with that is what's happened with previous big projects, is that huge swathes of the city are utterly untouched by the impacts of that investment. It doesn't change anything for the people I represent, for instance, out in Stetchford, Glebe Farm and Tile Cross. So I think we do need to look at how as a city we develop a framework, a sort of series of tests, if you like, about how we challenge and bend the spend to benefit the local supply chain and grow new business, grow new social enterprise opportunities. And again, that's something I'm really keen to hear thoughts from people here this morning. The other thing, I think, in terms of place-based impact investment is that we need to start by putting prevention right at the front of this. Too much has been about treating symptoms rather than causes. So how do we rewire the system? So we're eliminating problems, whether that's health and mobility issues, whether that's educational exclusion, whether that's homelessness or mental health. So in terms of changing that approach, there's just 3 bits of good practice I'd like to pull out from Birmingham in terms of a place-based hotspot approach. The first is actually something we've been doing around adult social care, which is the neighbourhood networks and the remodelling work we've been doing there. So we had a model of adult social care in this city that was very traditional, based on expensive residential care packages. The prevention model, of course, that we got was under financial pressure and was perhaps based on an old-fashioned grant-based approach to third sector development that tended to create dependency and stifled innovation a little bit, frankly. So the new model that we've moved to as the council, we've worked with the third sector, co-designed some outcomes and the means by which we measure the impact. It's place-based, so it targets specific geographical communities and communities of interest, and it's led by local organisations who facilitate local networks of support for adult social care. And it's based on 10 neighbourhood networks that represent real geographic models in the city. It's community-led, of course, so they own it, they shape it. 1 minute, right. The second one, and I see the banners already up there, and I'm sure there's people in the room who can talk about it far more passionately than I can, is the Use It project, the Unlocking Social and Economic Innovation Together. That's £3 million that's come largely from European Regional Development Fund, put into a partnership of 15 local organisations. By investing in those organisations, they've made some major inroads in driving people out of poverty in one of the most challenged parts of Birmingham. And that's been very much social enterprise led. We've got 65 members of the community who are trained as community researchers. You've got 200 professionals who had overseas medical qualifications who were now directed to access jobs within the local NHS. And we've got 120 social enterprises supported and 5 consortia of social enterprises created out of that approach. And I think the Use It methodology is a really important one that we can grow. I think the third one you mentioned, which of course is Pinch, which is the network that we've put together to try and invest and support and enable voluntary sector activity, and perhaps we'll address that more because I'm conscious of time in the discussions. I think just to conclude for me, I'm 2 months back into this cabinet portfolio. My role is very much around challenging the council and other partners about how do we scale up these approaches, how do we take the good practice and ensure that we move it out of pockets and really have a systematic approach to using this to generate real social and economic renewal across the city. So really keen to have that discussion here with you this morning.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, let's move on to Claire. We'll do all of the context, I think.
Are we just expanding spatial levels now?
Yeah. So I think what we'll try and do is we'll hear from Claire and John next, and then we'll come to Grace and to Steve. The Mayor convened the Social Economy Task Force back last year, which I'm declaring an interest. I've been also part of, along with a number of people in the room. And imminently, we're about to present a number of bold recommendations around growing the social economy. I'm not going to wear a Carol is, and I'm going to give it all away. Just saying.
I'm going to give some of it away.
Well, okay. Well, it's all right if you do. She might have me. That's fine. And it's very clear that there are some those economic outputs where business growth will require capital along the way in order to do those things. So the question is for you, what role does the West Midlands Combined Authority have in supporting both strategically and more practically on delivering on these recommendations, and how do you think social investment or any other type of investment will help to do that?
Yeah. So I'm going to start in a kind of act of intense self-preservation with inclusive growth, which is in my job title, and I think with any kind of fancy term that will have its day, it's important to make a case for it. And I've found the best way to describe inclusive growth is to say this is an economy which has the same values as the citizens of its place. And I think one of the things we've really become quite bad at over the years is kind of actually understanding why people bother going to work at all, which is because they want to thrive, because they want to be motivated, because they want to look after their families, because they want to be creative, they want to live a good life. And yet when we talk about what is strong about an economy, we measure quite an anodyne thing, which is GDP, which is just a transfer of activity going like this, and that could be building and knocking down the same house 1 million times, and it's like, which you could obviously do if you're really keen on increasing GDP, but actually does it have any additional value? I'd probably say not. And so I think this social economy task force to the combined authority is one of the first really tangible ways where we've started to think about what can we do to make inclusive growth a reality and show some of the ways that this can be done. And the wonderful thing about social enterprise is that it is so far ahead of the game, because the whole point of setting up a social enterprise is to put something bigger than your commercial identity at the heart of your business. It's important that you make money, but that money is serving a purpose, just as it does for normal humans in their everyday life. So that's kind of like the most meaningful way I found to describe it, because I've heard some very kind of like iffy definitions of inclusive growth, and I think it's fair to say that it's definitely benefited from what we call constructive ambiguity in the combined authority business. We do an awful lot with constructive ambiguity. That is the reality of the cross-party political system. So, as Mel said, we established the Social Economy Task Force, I think it was in February 2018. And it was precisely for the sort of purpose you highlighted, really, is really to understand what the combined authority can do that is additional to make this work. So there were 3 key things that we really wanted to do. The first was obviously strengthen the social economy. The second was helping charities, social enterprises and community organisations to deliver public service outcomes, so particularly in the areas where the combined authority is most engaged around homelessness, around radical prevention, etc. And also creating a bit of a development plan for area where a bit of cross-sector collaboration between public, private, third sector can help to meet some of those challenges. But we're also quite aware that we don't want to kind of ruin anything by stomping all over it. You know, there has been really good work in the cities over many, many years. We don't need to ruin things by kind of meddling where we're not wanted. Actually, our value is much more in the space of looking at a project like Use It, for example, looking at something that has really worked and think about what's our role in kind of scaling that and making it better. So I am going to give you a spoiler now, so Carol can give me the stern eye if it's too much. But I think, so as you can see, the task force has been running for a little over a year. And I think one of the things they were really keen to do is to keep it quite focused, because I think when you're looking at a piece of work where the delivery of it is probably over a decade or more, as we all know, we've lived through quite a lot of change in the last few years. I think we can anticipate there'll probably be some more, and we really want a piece of work that's going to be resilient and that's going to hang together over a little while. So we've just said, as a task force, that I think that what we want to do is double the size of the social economy within 10 years. And that's almost learning some of the lessons of capitalism, I would say. It's like if you remain focused on one thing, which is profit, you tend to be quite good at it. So we're going to learn that lesson, and we're going to solely focus on doubling the size of the social economy, and all of the recommendations we've come up with will serve that purpose. So in as much as what we think we can do in order to do that, I think some of it is about events like this. So one of the key things that comes out, and Sarah mentioned it in her introduction, is do people really know what social enterprise is? Do they know what it's capable of? Do they know how to invest in one? Do they know how to buy its products? Do you know as a commissioning organisation how to involve them in your supply chains? And I think we have a bit of responsibility to make sure that events like CITYDRIVE and all other things that kind of sit around that are generally well supported and can continue and can crop up in different parts of the region as well. So we've got some real social enterprise strength in Birmingham and Coventry, little pockets around the Black Country as well, but I think it's fair to say it's not an even spread. And I think I'm not misrepresenting members of the task force when I think when we were choosing between do we make the Birmingham and Coventry clusters really strong versus trying to spread it out a bit more, I think it was quite clear that people thought that spreading it out was probably the right thing, because actually one of the real strengths of social enterprise businesses is that they quite often occur in what people call the foundational economy, so the economy of places, the things that make places and neighbourhoods work. So coming back to John's comment about your two Birminghams, and I think it's about 40% of Birmingham's residents who live in the kind of the less well-off Birmingham, frankly. Having a strong foundational economy in your place, serving your place, employing your people, skilling you up is an incredibly important thing. The really big thing in the set, so we've been doing quite a lot of work around what we're kind of terming intermediary organisations. So, for example, some of you might be familiar with Energy Capital, which is a piece of work which is all about organising energy innovation and distribution and generation and like bodies to try and make our value a bit more coordinated, because we're not kind of getting the maximum value out of that. But again, to use It as an example, this is an example of an intermediary organisation, as is Pinch, but it's just thinking about what are these kind of collections of things that are going on that help an economy to be bolstered and help it to grow. 1 minute, gosh, okay. So I think what's been really clear is that in some of the kind of social investment space, I guess there's investment into individual businesses, but actually into some of the structures that makes that work. I'm hopefully not going to offend any LEP people, as I've got two nearby, when I say that LEPs have not exactly nailed what it takes to support the social enterprise and social economy. So I think we have to be really quite deliberate in how we think, all right, what are those intermediary organisations, what are those types of support, and how do we need to distribute that in the region to make that work? And frankly, that will take investment. It might not all be from the CA, but we've got a really important role in coordinating that. I am just going to tick all the way to the end now, I think, because in like my 1 minute. So just in some of the things where I think social investment is quite helpful, we've done the intermediary organisations, drawing on my own history with community-owned energy, if we're talking about how we lock in wealth into places, actually if we're doing a lot of capital investment, which the combined authority is, anything that enables people to own land or energy systems is one very tangible way of locking in wealth and is very ripe for social investment. Obviously, we've got a much broader capital programme, but social investment, again, can help us to unlock some of the added value to that. So who is benefiting skills-wise? What are the materials we're using? Are we feeding a circular economy? What kind of places are we designing? And it also helps us in the broader public service reform area. So there is a prevention fund coming down the line which will work in vaguely the same way as some of our other kind of capital investment funds, but in as much as how we think about how are you designing out poverty, how are you designing out homelessness. And I think if we can join up some of that core prevention fund with other pots of social investment, I think we could start to see some really exciting system changing work and building on some of the stuff that's already happened.
Lovely, thank
Okay.
you very much. And there's lots of great national research by Social Enterprise UK to talk about that foundational economy in terms of the fact that social enterprises are much more likely to be based in those very places where those challenges exist because people come together to try and find a solution, often through business, which is great. And also some great national examples of things like Fair by Design, which is designed to try and erase poverty and is bringing a number of different types of capital streams in to stop there being a premium for being poor, effectively. So stop you having to pay for, the most expensive prices for things like white goods and things like that. So lots more we can come back to there. Let's round the circle with Joel in terms of, and actually we've got 3 LEP representatives on here. We've got Steve down the end as well.
Don't worry, I'll probably do the offending first.
You don't have to worry. None of us are sensitive flowers. We're okay. And it's not a surprise. Joel will hear me say on most of it. It is the most frustrating voluntary job I've ever had in my life, as I am the social enterprise champion on the Greater Birmingham Solihull LEP. So, and I Joel feels some of that frustration at times. So. Let's do this from, you've seen life from both sides of the coin here as a serial entrepreneur, having to move over and, try and get to grips, and I know I've struggled this sometimes about what this looks like in a more sort of semi-public capacity. So let's go to the left. What are the main challenges and opportunities for embedding the concept of impact investing and social value the organisations who receive this investment deliver within the priorities of an infrastructure like the local enterprise partnership?
Well, for context, it's interesting for me sitting here and having seen both sides of the fence, because those who know me in my normal capacity, they would now be the person kind of saying almost F the system. But the beauty about being inside the system is that you have to have the mentality to want to help from within. And so we have a team of individuals in the LEP now who are now looking at the future and making sure that we're underpinning that thinking with what we do moving forward. But I will be honest and say that there is a time, this is now a time for things to be done differently. And so in terms of what I'm going to talk about, I'll give you some insight in some of the things that we are doing differently, but I will be realistic about what's happening in the region from an entrepreneurial and a private sector point of view, as well as that LEP perspective. So in terms of the main challenges, I think first and foremost, one of the challenges changed the perception of social enterprises within the private sector and within the local angel investment market. The challenge with the local investment market is that it's very fragmented. There are very few sustainable angel networks. The ones that are here are very much kind of, these are my kind of businesses, these are my angels. There's a lack of collaboration. So when you've got a fragmented market, it's particularly around investment, and then you've got a private sector market that does not necessarily on the main see social enterprises in the same way that they see commercial businesses, you have that kind of challenge. So what we're trying to do is trying to make sure that social entrepreneurs, first and foremost, see themselves as business owners, not keeping themselves in a very charitable mindset. And I think that's very, very key. I think historically the view has been, you hear social enterprise, you think charity, you think good people, you think hippies, it's not about that at all. Social enterprises are business owners. They just do something different with their profit, or their purpose is different, their value proposition is different. but there's a responsibility for the private sector to treat businesses from social enterprise backgrounds who work on those purposes with the same respect that they treat other businesses. Because that's the only way we're going to be able to unlock that value that social enterprises have. And so within that, though, there is still some foundational support that's needed. So some of the core things that social enterprises need to scale in terms of good processes, good systems, good access to markets, good access to finance. These are the fundamental things that I think the private sector can work with social enterprises to bring in to help them to get to that capacity point when they can then deliver long term. So the challenge between the perception and then the financial market not being as connected as it ought to be, I think is two parts of the same coin for me. The other thing is then the financiers having actual continual evidence of commercial and social impact and seeing it in that way. Seeing social impact as something that is investable long term, and I know Grace and I know yourself, Mel, and Steve, actually, in terms of the work you've been doing, you've always been pushing that agenda. But I think overall, the finance community still can't get their head around social impact and commercial impact in the same way, at the same level. So there's still some kind of education that needs to take place on a continual basis. So the financial community can say, okay, there is that tangible evidence. Which then links me into the third point, which is the intangible value that social enterprises offer. I remember with one of my prior social enterprises where we did some work, and I won't take you through the story for the context of time, but little things like seeing the young person who's coming to the workshop not coming in his cap anymore, turning up on time, actually having manners. It's those intangible things that show you that things are working. And that particular gentleman I'm thinking about is now working in the city centre. And he goes back to his community and he gives talks and he gives support back to his community to inspire them. So it's the little intangible things that start from small things that we should be building on to help create that tangible value long term for our social enterprises. But at the same time, the challenge for social enterprises is articulating their value proposition. We talked about that with one of the events earlier in the week, where there's your unique selling point and there's your unique value proposition, and then what makes you really different and how are you selling that. And so there's the responsibility on both sides to make sure that the value you're creating is being articulated in the right way to the right stakeholders in the way that they wish to understand it. So those for me are the kind of some of the core challenges. But I think within, I'd be wrong as an entrepreneur to not think of the opportunities within those challenges. And I think there's three major opportunities for the region. And then I'll just give a bit of an insight into how we as a LEP are looking at some of those opportunities. So one is this notion of business model disruption. So we're seeing that, social enterprises are closer to the societal challenges. They naturally would have diverse workforces by the very nature of how they operate and by the very nature of how they engage people on the ground to get behind their social causes. And they've had to learn to be innovative and learn to have to be resilient because they've had to survive on a lot of times on scarce resource. A heavy reliance on funding circles stop. It's like their business is starting all over again, and that has to stop. We need more support for social enterprises so they have a long-term, sustainable funding stream of support, not just reliant on EIDF or ECIF or whatever grant funding is available at that time. That stops when someone in Whitehall decides that it's no longer relevant. We need to kind of kill that. But I think those are the types of elements that can help for-profit businesses and straight commercial businesses to future-proof their business. Because we have to think about the other side, that for-profit businesses are in a very much a competitive and have to be sustainable themselves. We're no longer living in a competitive world where your competition is next door. Everyone's global, whether you want to be or not. And so it's about making sure that you can add value to those stakeholders by showing why you're different and then being part of that supply chain and being supported and integrated into that. So as a LEP, social enterprise is now a strategic part of our business support where it wasn't before. So social enterprise and the inclusive growth agenda are now core strategic drivers. So you'll see a lot more activity around that from us here. There's a latent profit potential. So I think it was Professor Mark Hart talked about 93% of social enterprises versus 76% of SMEs generate a surplus profit last year. So there's money in social enterprises. Social enterprises are being profitable. But how are we helping them to be more profitable, to add more of that social value? And so again, we're looking at how we're helping social enterprises to think differently about what it means to make money and helping them to innovate their own business models to be more financially sustainable. And the final thing is the other elephants in the room is that we're very much a young and very much a diverse population. So how are we leveraging the millennial value that we have in the region. How are we helping to engage and include and incubate the next generation of social entrepreneurs? So their thinking has been integrated into the policies and the activity that they're going to be the beneficiaries of. So often we create policies for ourselves because we talk to ourselves. We forget that we're not going to feel the benefit of the policies that we're putting in. It's going to be the next generation. So how are we including them now at those decision-making tables? So we're creating things that they want in the future, not what we want. And so we're working very closely with the skills team here, and Gary here from the LEP as well, in terms of how we're making sure that we're bringing forward the next generation of entrepreneurs, so they are part of that narrative and part of that legacy for the future that we all want to be a part of.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And they're not even, they're not even the millennials when you have to think about them in terms of the creative business. They're also our social consumers of the future, so and they're ever more aware than ever we were at this time. So then, Grace, moving on to you. So, Resonance picked the Greater West Midlands as its second place for the creation of a fund which targets investing in the dismantling of poverty. And the fund uses a relatively new tax incentive called Social Investment Tax Relief, or CITR, as we often... we're not going to go over that in detail. If you do want to know, come listen to Grace and I tomorrow in London. We're talking at a legal conference about CITR. But it's a tax incentive that essentially gives investors 30% back on their investment if they invest into an eligible social enterprise or charity. Well, a question I particularly wanted to ask you was about your investors. We've heard about angel investors over here, so let's just talk about your investors. Are your investors motivated by investing into geography? Is it about the social issue or the dismantling of poverty that's important to them, or are they just in it for the financial return? Tell us a little about.
Great. Well, I guess it's going to be a bit cliche answer, but it's true that it's a mixture of all three. So I'll go through each, just give a bit more thought on that. So first of all, the kind of place-based geography element of our West Midlands fund. For some investors, that is incredibly important, and it for them is probably one of the key motivators for them. So it might be that they've grown up in the West Midlands, or their business has kind of flourished in the West Midlands and they really want to give something back. And there's some of the really kind of very interesting conversations I have with investors about what they kind of feel the West Midlands have done for them, and then they kind of want to invest back into that through social enterprise. So that's definitely probably about 40 to 50% of our West Midlands investors, I would say. Well, they literally are from the West Midlands, so that's one of the key reasons they have got involved in this fund rather than others. But about 50 to 60% of investors in our West Midlands fund are not from the West Midlands at all, and for them, they might not even have any connection to the area. But it is still an interesting one, because I think for a lot of them, the kind of place-based geography focus of the West Midlands Fund is still very important to them, and to Resonance as a company as well. Our kind of strategy, I guess, is to really focus on place at the moment. So there's kind of three reasons that I think from the conversations I've had with investors and what we've seen as an investor ourselves, why we think place-based investment, or place-based social investment, is really important and effective. The first is definitely around the impact. I guess it's a no-brainer really that when you focus resources in one area, you are going to have a more tangible kind of focused impact, because you're focusing everything in one area, and it's also easier to see the outcomes of that rather than kind of doing a scattergun approach across the whole country and not really ever knowing how it would all relate. So that for us as a kind of social investment company was the starting point for us, that we wanted to try and have a better, kind of bigger, more tangible impact by getting a bit more focused. But secondly, I guess related to that, our place-based investment initiatives, we've been able to be much more focused on investing in networks and infrastructure in an area than we have been on our kind of UK national type funds. So that might be running local events, participating in things like this, but also actually providing the introductions and kind of networks for social enterprises that we work with. We actually set up something alongside our West Midlands Fund that we just call, not very creatively, our Business Support Network. So that's where we encourage local people to also invest time and skills into supporting social enterprises locally. So again, that's just not possible if you're doing it kind of across a massive area, because investors can't necessarily commit to giving their time and skills if it's not local. So that's been another really valuable benefit, hopefully, to social enterprises from the place-based approach. And then finally, I think this is the most important thing for me, is that working on a local social investment fund has enabled us and investors to build much better relationships with social enterprises, which I think when you talk about social investment, that for me is the most crucial thing, because I think for a social enterprise taking on investment, it can be a really huge thing, and I think being able to trust the investor they're working with and actually have a real relationship with them that they can sustain over the many years that we will hopefully be working together is really, really important, and it can be a really scary thing. So I think I definitely feel when I've been working on a local fund, I've been much more able to build those relationships with the enterprises and genuinely feed into their businesses in a way that I couldn't do if they were kind of millions of miles away, or even hundreds of miles away. And I think that's firstly important when taking on the investment to build that confidence and trust, but also after the investment as well, because I think that can also be quite a scary and high pressure time sometimes for social enterprises. Maybe things aren't going to plan, and things kind of, have to have kind of scary conversations with their investors to say actually things aren't going the way we said they would. That's quite a difficult conversation to have if your investor's really far away and you have to organise a big meeting and everyone has to pay a lot of money to get there and you've only got an hour or so in the middle of London. But if you regularly popping in to see how things are going and they see you all the time, it's much more of a natural thing to actually say, oh look, this isn't really going to plan, can you help? And we've definitely really seen that with place-based investment, that's been a big difference. So that said, you asked about, is it about financial return or social return? So very quickly, social impact is definitely a key motivator for the investors that we work with in this fund. I mean, they could definitely get a higher return and probably more tax relief and things in other opportunities. So the return is important, but the social impact is always a key motivator. And I guess the key reason why they initially start the conversation, they've normally got some kind of personal story that's led them to want to consider social investment. They've normally supported charities or things in the past, but kind of want to explore new ways of giving back maybe a bit more sustainably or on a bigger scale. That said, I think the financial return element of social investment is really important, because we're effectively trying to say to an investor, look, we don't want this to be a one-off thing. We don't want you to just kind of give the money away and never think about it again. We want you to recycle that and hopefully invest it again into another social enterprise. But that can be really difficult for social enterprises because typically for the type of investment social enterprises are after, which is unsecured loans with quite flexible repayment terms, you are normally looking at about 10, 12, even 15% in some cases for that type of loan per annum, which in most cases is just not really very possible at all to service. So as Mel said, with our place-based fund, really to make that work, despite all the kind of benefits of place-based investments that I've just gone through, we have had to incorporate a subsidy which, as Mel said, in our case we've used the social investment tax relief, which is a benefit for the investor, but we've used that to effectively subsidise the cost of social investment, so that some of the financial return can be covered by that tax relief, and we can try and reduce that kind of 12%-ish cost to about 6 to 7% cost per annum. So definitely more, well, we hope more accessible and more possible for social enterprises to think about growth. So to wrap up really, I think three things are really important. Loads of benefits of place-based investment that we want to try and help unlock through the West Midlands Fund. But investors definitely really, really care about social impact. Place-based investment can help really enhance that, we think. And the financial return, I think, to make that work within a place-based fund, we do think there still needs to be some kind of subsidy.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Grace.
No problem.
So this element about building trust is something that comes up time and time again. You know, social enterprises and charities say, who are these social investors? Where does their money come from? How do they need to charge me this much interest? You know, all of those sorts of things. And a lot of that's built around understanding. And I certainly, since I crossed over from running a social enterprise to working in social investment, have seen people going from the perspective of going, oh no, you know, I can't possibly want to borrow money. I'm only interested in grant. What do you mean you have to pay it back with interest? to getting to grips with having enough information to make these decisions. And the point about it being seen as very London-centric, you know, these people that sit in ivory offices a long way away from me, has been a real challenge, which I think some of the place-based and having local relationships helps. So lovely segue into local relationships. So I'm not going to call you around the block, I'm going to call you a stalwart now.
Can I look that up on Google?
So as long as I've been around in this space talking about it, Steve's been there much longer than I have. And I suppose you've seen it all, Steve, from the advent of having money to lend and not having anybody wanting to borrow it, to having to work out how to fund your own organisation to try and meet the demand in place. So we've already heard about subsidy in the form of SITR as a tax relief. And we were going to have a speaker here that was going to talk about blended capital. So that's when you bring grant and repayable finance together, which again can often act as a subsidy. But you've been using another type of tax relief called CITR, we're all for acronyms today, aren't we? Which Community Investment Tax Relief.
It is indeed.
And to encourage investment into art so that you can therefore invest into place.
Yep.
So the question for you is, very briefly, because as I say, we're not got a long time for a tax seminar, you'll all be glad. How does CITR work, and how do we ensure a credible flow of capital for our place so that social enterprises, charities and SMEs who are unable to access bank finance can do so?
Yeah.
And if you can do that all in 7 minutes, thank you.
7 minutes, thanks. That's one less minute I've already
I know,
got
sorry.
out. So. There's an element of deja vu which I start with because 20 years was mentioned there. It was 21 years since Art Business Loans, which was then Aston Reinvestment Trust, was formed, and we raised money. And we are a social enterprise. Let's do the initials, get them out of the way. We were called a Community Development Financial Institution. What a mouthful! Suddenly changed their names to Responsible Finance Providers, even more of a mouthful. And a horrible branding change, because at the end of the day, Wonga used Responsible Finance on their TV adverts, so you suddenly became that. But we've got this thing called Community Investment Tax Relief. And Community Investment Tax Relief it's been around since 2003. It is only available to those organisations that are accredited to actually give that tax relief to investors. But it's been predominantly used at the start by two major banks called Charity Bank and Triodos Bank. And they were lenders into social enterprise and the economy. And the reason that they got most of the money to start with is because they had that wonderful word, bank. Now, I say it's a wonderful word, it's not necessarily a wonderful word. I've got to be careful here because I've got my bankers sitting over there, Unity Trust, who've been the biggest users of community investment tax relief in helping us to use community tax relief for the capital that we lend on to small business social enterprises. When we first started, and this is why the element of deja vu comes around, we were a startup, and we went out. I was 29 years with Barclays, and I came into this world of social enterprise, and the first workshop I attended was developing social enterprises and financing social enterprises. And basically, I didn't even know what social enterprises were. And to actually hear some course of this week, people still actually saying what a social enterprise is, 21 years on, is a little bit worrying, really. A little bit worrying. But on the other hand, I've seen some wonderful social enterprises, and we've supported some wonderful social enterprises. I've got to say that because I'm sitting opposite from Change Kitchen, who basically has been one of our borrowers. But at the end of the day, there've been some wonderful examples, but we've moved, and we actually now lend to small businesses that are unable to get their funding from the bank. And CITR has been all about helping CDFIs to raise money. And it targets underserved communities, which is what social enterprise, what we've talked about, which is what social enterprises do. But so do small businesses in terms of place. And a lot of small businesses will say, and particularly the micro businesses located in particular areas of deprivation, will say that they have a social value in supply chains, local economy. And I'd agree totally and utterly with that. Well, we as a social enterprise are there to help those. And we've lent nearly 25 million and a portfolio of about 5.5 million. But the places that CITR work on, which gives, by the way, 5% of the amount invested off a person's tax bill for 5 years each year. Now that is a lot better than you're going to get in an ISA, a lot better than you're getting at any bank, and that is a real return. The people who invest in us, and we've just done a community share offer, which I'll plug. which is finished now, so you can't invest in it. But it's
So what's the point?
because we're going to do it again, Joel. Because we're going to do it again. So there's some lovely pictures in here. There's some great examples.
Good, or I'll be having to do a promotional disclaimer at this point.
But oh dear, don't talk to me about that.
Keep going,
Well,
keep going.
Here we go. So in actual fact, and I'll come back to some lessons on that, but the important thing in relation to CITR is actually it looks at place disadvantage and the lending that we have to do with the money that we raise, because all the money we raise doesn't go towards helping us, it's all got to be on lent, and it's got to be lent into those areas of disadvantage. We started in inner city Birmingham. That was our first 6 areas of inner city Birmingham, and there was an area called North Solihull, mostly called Chelmsley Wood. And those were the only areas we lent in. And the interesting thing, thinking back, and John's been there long enough, in those days, many of you will remember area regeneration initiatives. £50 million went into 5 of those areas. What changes were made? And you highlighted, not a lot. I would like to see if money's now coming in from whatever source, austerity, whatever money comes in, I'd like to say the money be used in a better way than it was for that 50 million. We caught the end of that because we raised £360,000 initially from individuals and companies all those years ago with no return promised. It was real social investment. Those people were expecting it. Now we're raising, and we've just raised £250,000 giving that tax relief. And I'm going to echo your experiences, Grace, because amazingly the vast majority of the money didn't come from people of the West Midlands, and we now lend in the whole of the West Midlands. It came from individuals outside of the West Midlands willing to invest in the West Midlands. Now, for PR purposes, I wasn't going to say that, but now I'm on film, I've just said it. But at the end of the day, it is a startling thing that the people outside have actually invested. And I would totally agree from our experience, they didn't invest just because they wanted to invest in the West Midlands. They didn't invest just because they wanted the tax return. They invested for a combination of probably both. And in actual fact, some people have different motives. But they actually have invested. And some of them didn't know us from Adam, which I think is interesting, which means that a lot of people out there, if they know more, and I'm coming now to the most important part, is raising awareness. Because at the end of the day, if people don't know about social enterprises, don't know about the opportunities, don't know the fact that at the end of the day, for example, we're supported hugely by Unity Trust Bank. I hate to say it, some people don't know when we talk to them, they don't even know who Unity Trust Bank is, and it's based in Birmingham, and basically one of the biggest lenders to the social economy in any case. But at the end of the day, if we don't actually get our act together in sort of joining now together and spreading the word, then we're missing an opportunity. And that would be my sort of concluding here. Apart from one thing you did say, and I will end on this, I think it's really good to give an example, and Sarah will know that I've bumped into her about 3 times this week, and she's always been carrying food. And basically, at the end of the day, I like to give food examples. I've got Change Kitchen here, but there's a food example of a social enterprise. Let's give an example of someone we lent to who had an aspiration to own his own restaurant, and he lived in Smith's Wood, and he couldn't get the full requirement from the bank. And basically, we lent to Glyn Purnell to start his restaurant. Glyn Purnell, at the end of the day, at startup, couldn't get his full requirement from the bank. Did get some support from the bank. We lent some more money. He remortgaged his house. He's since gone on to be 2 restaurants. He's basically a BBC personality or TV personality, the Yummy Brummy. But what did he do as well? Most importantly, from our point of view, he recruited people from the university and gave them an opportunity. One of those he recruited from the university, who now makes the most magnificent macaroons, is basically Miss Macaroon. And she basically runs a social enterprises and a social enterprise ambassador. So you can see from small businesses and recruitment and employment, you get other things coming. And you do that as well in other areas of Birmingham other than the places with all the big cranes.
Yep.
And I come from Acott's Green, and I know that well.
Thank you very much, Steve. Right, so I hope we're ready with the questions. We have got definitely some issues here around trust and awareness. We've got these things about building relationships with the sector so they understand how social investment can be used. I hear and echo that. We've had some discussions about where the money could come from, capital. So we've talked about angel investors, you know, your Dragon's Den, or Social Angels, maybe a bit less dragon, but you know, on that sort
Still a bit of
still a bit, yeah, absolutely. So that's all about putting money in. One of the challenges around angel investors is usually they want to put in what we would call equity investment, so investment into shares. And obviously lots of our governing structures mean that that's not always the way that we can take money in, so we have to think about more creative ways to take that type of money in. And also then Steve's making the point, and actually it works for a bit for, definitely for SITR, and not quite the same, could it be organisational money for CITR, but we're really talking about retail investment here. What we're talking about is a mass. So I'm conscious that we've used a few terms along the way, CDFIs, angel investors. The thing that I find is, you know, I often still sit in things and go, oh, I've got no idea what they're talking about now. My standard one I always say, isn't it? First conference I went to about social investment, this was a fantastic speaker for striding up and down talking about mezzanine debt, and I was like, is that another floor? So I don't really understand what that means. So, you know, never feel that we shouldn't be empowered. The thing we know from lots of user research is that social enterprises and charities don't want this stuff dumbed down, but they do want us to explain what we mean. And it's just about getting comfortable with all that terminology. So, do we have any questions? I'll take a few if we've got them. If not, I'm ready with my list. I'm looking at it. Good, Carol, because you were on my list. So go on.
Scratch her off there.
I am Carol Donnelly. I've stepped across the border from Coventry, so please forgive me, because we are learning so much from Birmingham and CITYDRIVE. Absolutely brilliant what you've done here. We are part of, obviously been invited to the Access Fund. Coventry is one of the 12 selected, and one of the key things is to double the social investment in Coventry and to learn from what Birmingham are doing. But there is a fear amongst the social enterprises especially of taking on debt. I have my own social enterprise. I'm sitting there with a portfolio of £45,000 I can draw down, but I'm still in the People's Project because that's free money. So even for my own social enterprise, that fear is there. So I just want to know, one sentence, how can I talk to the social enterprises across Coventry and the West Midlands to say, overcome the fear, go for investment? What is the one thing that you would say to me that I could then share with our social enterprises to take on that investment?
Can I kick that one off?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so let's have that question. I have a question from...
No, I want to answer that.
Oh, you want to answer?
From a social enterprise, you know, from the same position, I think the really big thing to bear in mind is that social investment is something. I mean, it has now come. I think it's much easier to get it. It's much cheaper now for us to get it, and I think it's money you can do with what you really want to do. You can really go down your mission rather than with getting grants. You have to do what the funder happens to want to fund. I think that's the simple answer.
I think that the one word answer, I mean, just highlighting there that there are lots and lots of different now funds. Yeah. That's the difference. We've already mentioned Grace very cleverly plugged the fact that her interest rate is considerably lower than ours, which it is, and that's great, because at the end of the day that means there's a movement into the market. But Grace won't do certain things that we will do, is the simple answer. And our interest rate isn't right because we've actually stuck to our guns because we're a social enterprise and we've got to be sustainable. If we lend at the rates that Grace is lending at, I wouldn't be sitting here today. We'd be gone. So we have to lend to that. But there are others. There's the one you mentioned, the Key Fund, which is a combination of grant and loan. Personally, I really like to see that because at the end, they're a combination of grant and loan. But in answer to your question, debt in its own right is not any good to anybody unless they've got an ability and a long-term business plan to repay it and show how to repay it. So debt plus the interest, whether it be 6% or 13% or whatever, at the end of the day can only be good if you've got the ability to repay it. And that, for me, is one of the issues. It's got to have the aspiration of social enterprises to grow and be bigger, because otherwise, if they stay very small, all they'll be doing is looking for the next hand out and not hand up. And we'll be back to where we were before. And that is no good. So, but there are some tremendous social enterprises that have got that aspiration and are growing. And that's what we've got to look for.
So if I take, sorry Sarah, I'll come to you just one minute. So if I would just take as a chair's imperative here, the fact that what Steve has said, peers are a great source, of information. I often hear people in the events that I do say, I've come to find out what the social investors won't tell me, and that's that trust piece, because actually you believe it when a peer tells you the warts and all bit that they understand. So there's some great lessons out there that peers can share. It is about risk. Everything's about risk. I often get asked, is debt bad? No, only bad debt is bad, okay? So it's about understanding when it's the right tool for the job. The thing that's really important is we have enough knowledge to know when it's the right tool, and it is and can be much more flexible. And then all of the things that we've talked about here, the way that you find out who the right investor, who's got the right money, who does the type of lending, is you go to goodfinance.org.uk. Sorry, I had to get that in.
That's what you should say.
Because it used to be really difficult. It used to be really difficult to have that choice or selection. But yes, I would say the question I get asked most often is it worth it, Mel? Is taking on debt, is it worth it? And the answer is only you can answer that, you and your board. Sarah?
I just wanted to take the conversation a little bit deeper. So a lot of work that we do as a social enterprise development organisation is reaching into communities, supporting individuals who have only really just found out about the term social enterprise. And the great thing that we've been able to do through the Use It project is to support those individuals who have not the kind of personal networks where they know a banker or banking or have any experience of getting money. They don't know solicitors. They don't have the networks that enable them to develop and grow their business. And so I think that the way I want to add to what the Use It project's been able to do is to broker those relationships and broker those opportunities. And similarly, I don't think that we have enough opportunity to broker people into accessing the money. And I just wonder what the panel thinks in terms of what the potentials are to develop some opportunities, some structures and so on to think about that, because it really isn't going to happen. You're only going to get those organisations borrowing the money that understand it, because it's really scary. We worked with 100 individuals last year where we did, what is the difference between loan and equity? What do you need to do to think about preparing for it? And then even we know that it might take a year before they might dip their toe. And then working with boards who are paralysed by it because they think they might have to sign their houses away. So I think there's something about understanding that we need some different ways to make this happen if we really want to invest in play.
I mean, just on that, Sarah. So the LEP's here, and then we've got the Growth Hub as the business support function within the LEP. Within the Growth Hub, we have an access to finance service. That's free for every single business in the region to use. The access to finance service is actually being run, so we've procured a private sector organisation to deliver that for that exact reason, because they've got the view of the whole market from an external point of view. So it's not just what funding is available from a public sector point of view, but they have a view on what's happening in terms of the types of debt funding that might be useful for you, the types of angel investment funding networks you can belong to, connect to, all of that type of thing. And so what we're wanting to do, and this is what we was talking about early in the week, is about how we can then have someone from a social enterprise aspect to come in and bring some of that financial knowledge in, which is where Melanie's been helping us in terms of making sure that we've got the social value policy right internally in the organisation. We get the culture right, and then we can make sure that we're connecting the businesses in the right way. So I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is a free access finance service that people can use to have those first conversations, but it is about bringing in that wider support as well, because often people come for finance when they don't need finance. And I'll probably be controversially incorrect, but you don't need finance to start, you need finance to grow. So I've come from the viewpoint that, well, let's break your business down, let's strip it back, let's see how you can innovate and make your business as sustainable as possible before you bring on the whatever finance, but then get the right support in to know what finance you need at that point. So it's that holistic approach that we're trying to take.
And I think it's very important that we understand that social investment in this, or repairable finance of any form is not going to be right for many social enterprises and charities. And honestly, lots of those very early conversations, it will be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, maybe never. We never say not ever, but actually we're probably, if I'm really honest with you, we're never going to be able to supply the type of capital to those organisations. It is going to take incubator money, crowdfunding money, grant money, pro bono support, all of those early types of interventions. I think the other thing that we have to do is we are extremely, I'm very proud to be from here, that's why I spend lots of my time here as much as in other parts of the country. But we also have to look upwards and outwards. Where you have got really strong networks and great people, there are also some great national schemes that you could bring in and make sure that you really use them. So there are, a whole stream of work that we do is around helping infrastructure to be able to do this work so that it's not going to bigger national organisations. And that stuff's already created. You just need to put your name on it and go and use the framework that is already there. And then you get other grant funding schemes like REACH Fund and also the Enterprise Development Grants, which are available to do that grant support to help get organisations to be capacity ready. They're national schemes, but if you've got local advocates, you can tap into them and make sure that you use them for this place. So it's a combination of those two things. Do we have any more questions? Yeah. Andy and sorry, I'll come to Pauline and Ted, can't you? Or is it you do together?
I think Pauline's Alex.
Sally. Let's do Sally and Andy first, and then I'll come back to my awesome duo.
So my question's a mixture for the sort of the council, LEP and combined authority. So from your perspective as organisations, do you understand what your spend currently is with social enterprises from a place perspective, and are you targeting yourselves to increase that? And then secondly, you mentioned HS2 and the Commonwealth Games. What influence are you using around those board tables to ensure that there's actual policies to state that they will have a certain percentage of not just social enterprise, but actually employment from local areas of deprivation, so that we're not just seeing, the kids from Solihull and Sutton Coldfield getting the train into town to walk down to sort of HS2 to work there, but we're actually seeing, individuals from Ladywood and different parts of the city.
So I'm going to come to Claire and John on that. Let's just have Sally a question.
It's more of a comment, if that's okay. There's been a lot of really positive talk about prevention and going further upstream and awareness raising. I've been involved in developing with ISC and supported by USIT a social enterprise in schools programme in primary schools. And I think the untapped potential for working with our schools to really get in those future social entrepreneurs is really powerful. The teachers are well excited about it, it helps the curriculum, but they can also see that those 8 to 10-year-olds that we're working with are really excited by the potential to change things in their own communities and do that through business.
Okay, so can I, on that comment, if it's okay, can I change it slightly and get John and I'll to comment on the comment, is that okay? And we'll go for LEP and West Midlands Combined Authority on Andy's point. Yeah.
Yeah, so the really simple answer to the are we measuring it is no, if that helps, and it doesn't in lots of ways, but what it has helped us to do, so as part of the social economy task force work, obviously as you might expect, we did go out and try and find out whether people were measuring it. And on the whole, while people through their social value policies are probably measuring what they commission from local businesses and SME, they do not kind of specify for social economy or social enterprise businesses on the whole. But that can't endure if we're to really if we're going to have a specific target about increasing the size of the social economy, we have to be targeted about it. So one of the, and for another spoiler from the final report, one of the things we're going to commit to is for our Office of Data and Analytics, which for full disclosure is about like 3 people at the moment, but it sounds quite grand, but we're going to use that capacity to try and work with regional partners, predominantly in the public sector, but hopefully further as well, to actually let's completely have a consistent definition of social economy, because this is another issue we've had, that even different LEPs are kind of taking slightly different measures, so our ability to compare has been quite limited. But if we can actually use our convening power to come up with this consistent measure, and then we work out through our social value task force how we will carry on doing that, I think we will be in a really good position to be able to be quite precise about it. So we are aware it's something that's got to be made better. With regards to things like HS2 and the Commonwealth Games, Commonwealth Games does have that provision within it, and this is something that Melanie's been a really powerful champion of this part of it. So much of social value policy applies when you get to big contracts, and social enterprises are crying out saying the things that matter to us quite often is not your big contracts. We can't always rely that these are broken down into small enough lots to be made into something that we want to go for. Actually, if your social value policies don't apply to your sub-OGU level, or OGUC as it might become, who knows, but if they don't apply below that, sorry, that doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? Let's discard that completely.
Sounds about right, doesn't it?
Yeah. But and again, because we've got this ongoing social value task force, one of the things they will be tasked with is that actually we have to be a bit more ambitious with that. And we have had some early good conversations with HS2 where it comes back to that same point. They're quite keen to procure from social enterprise. They see that as part of, you know, the way that they make value for themselves. But actually they're going, well, where does that fit in our supply chain? Like, can you put up a porter cabin? Can you supply catering to our workers? You know, and I think it's just helping them understand where their potential lies, and there should be some opportunities to do that.
I'm actually from HS2, so I can comment a little bit on that and to say that that is exactly the kind of thing that we're looking to do. So
I'm really relieved.
Yeah. You blagged that wonderfully. But more so that our contractors and the major work contractors in the area are very keen to do that, and they're already starting those conversations. So me and Sarah have met a few times to see how we can get involved there. I think it's fair to say it's quite early days still, because they're still developing their strategy and their programs, but there's absolutely a commitment. There's contractual commitments around SMEs as opposed to specifically social enterprises, but the desire is absolutely there, and I think it's just finding a way to make it.
Absolutely.
To make it happen.
And the reason I asked the question is so we have a phrase, what gets measured gets done. And I think this difference between desire and actual outcomes, I think it's brilliant that you're having those conversations. Absolutely.
Right, lovely. 1 minute from Joel, quickly on.
Literally, I'll be super quick. So just to kind of just clarify a couple of myths. So the LEP's role is as a convener and a facilitator. So we kind of glue things together where we see a market failure. So where we see there's opportunity to create a solution, that's where we bring partners together and see what funding we can put in to support that partnership or that consortium or whoever it is that can provide that solution. And so within that, we don't actually deliver any services as the growth hub. All our services are done through partnerships. So to answer your question, Andy, as you were with some of the activity in the projects, what we do is say, right, how can we provide growth hub development funding to projects who are already experts in what they're doing, and we can help them to do more of what they do. So it's more about that catalyzing approach rather than us saying we're going to fund all the activity. So we do a combination of match funding. But because our outcome is around driving economic growth, every project that we work with, we look at how many jobs they're creating, where those jobs are coming from, the kind of financial return that they could say they can get, the ratio of activity. So we try and, where possible, make sure that we're getting that evidence base to say, well, yes, investing in that is driving economic growth. And then from a social entrepreneurship point of view, it's about looking at moving forward. It's about saying, well, where are those people coming from? What's the impact you're creating? Where are you creating that impact? So that conversation there is now started with our program team. So our program team are the ones who invest in some of the large capital projects that you're seeing in the city. So there's some activity taking place as we speak to make sure some of those questions now go into those larger capital investment projects as well. So again, early days, a bit like the WMCA, but it's about saying, well, you need to start measuring and give evidence base of the social impact that you say you're creating. And that's something that we've got to keep pushing moving forward.
I think there's a very interesting thing here about this is not always a process argument, it's a cultural argument, okay? Yeah. So before Joel, I'll let you have a bye here, because before Joel joined the Greater Birmingham Solihull LEP, I was jumping up and down basically
on me.
Just to try and get us to have a social value policy that meant that we could have some leverage back to these larger things to say, actually, we can't look at this through a one-dimensional lens. It's not economic growth. It's not just about private sector jobs. Because actually, if the LEP is going to deliver by doing that bit, we have to look at it through that lens as well. So very often you find this stuff is cultural as much as it is process. You've got to get people in the right mindset to understand why that this is relevant. So that brings us quite neatly to Sally's point about early intervention and prevention, which is another core topic around how social investment can work. And I'm directing this to John and I suppose because I'm primary school governor, so this sits in my world, and I have an awful lot of organisations who come with these sorts of ideas. But this whole thing about how do you get budget holders, and particularly with the impact of austerity, which we'll know and feel for school budgets, how do we get budget holders to think about taking on or investing in things that will allow us to save money, and not just save money but get better outcomes for our young people, for our communities? How do we do that challenge? Because I know I was talking to somebody in, this was more about government spending review, and not that I claim to know a lot about it, but they were explaining it to me using Lego pictures, which I really got, which was great. Which is, you know, how do you, you start with this idea of a budget, and then when it all comes down to you've got to save 20% off that, and then it becomes much more of a bun fight. So how do you do that, particularly across a big authority? How do you get budget holders, portfolio holders to come together to look at some of that early intervention and prevention stuff?
Well, if I worked out the answer to that one, I wouldn't be sat here. But it is the $1 million question. So, and I think it's one that we've started to formulate an answer to in Birmingham. Of course, we've always got this constant pressure when it comes to this, that we have statutory, as a local authority, we have statutory duties to meet. Budget has massively shrunk, as I said in my opening remarks. We have to meet statutory duties first, but you're then into a perverse sort of logic that by removing all the discretionary stuff, which is the preventative activity, whether that's in homelessness or mental health or wherever, then creates a further demand on statutory services. So you're spending more money on stuff that produces a poorer outcome for individuals and communities. So I think part of this has to be about how you articulate the evidence base and the outcomes base more effectively, and you get that understanding across the organisation. It also has to be about how you align with the activities of other organisations as well. I mean, a really clear example of this is the kind of partnership that needs to take place between the local authority as a social care provider and what takes place in the health service sphere. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done around trying to integrate those worlds more effectively, so you've got a single public pound that's sort of trying to chase longer term outcomes. I think it's a real challenge that we have, and nobody has successfully found the solution to this yet. Just to pick up on a couple of other points that were made. I mean, one on the issue of the working with schools on social enterprises, I'll be really keen to have a further conversation with you around that, because I think, as Claire was saying at the outset, if we've got to change the dialogue and the conversation around what inclusive growth means, then we have to start early on, don't we? As in all things. So I'm really keen to explore that. And just on how we're approaching social enterprises and understanding our spend as a local authority, again, we've done a lot of mapping work around how we and other anchor institutions in the city are spending locally. Some of that comes out of that programme that we embarked upon. So I think the next stage is really articulating what's going into social enterprises and how do we use that information to then shape our future investment programme.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Right, I've got one here, one over here. Now Claire wants to come on with one thing, and then you've got an option. We can either keep going if you want, and we won't have any networking time, or we can wrap up and have the last 15 minutes networking. But let's just get Claire, one very quick thing.
It was just an add on to what, so coming back to your point on what gets measured gets done. What we don't measure is how we split our spend between primary, secondary, tertiary prevention and acute. And I think that's another thing that we are very keen to get done, because Greater Manchester has already done a little bit of this. But we have to, I think, if we're going to say investing into this is going to move this spending from here into here or get rid of that, we need to be able to be precise, because actually otherwise we don't get listened to.
Pauline, that's your question?
My question is about basics, digital skills. We aren't making the most of digital technology and data. We don't have enough together, we don't share enough information together. The West Midlands Office of Data Analytics has launched a tender about an information sharing charter. We're not in on the ground floor of that. We're not part of the Digital Skills Partnership. Our needs as a sector aren't being recognised by the Combined Authority as such, and we need to make more of a stand about that.
Mm-hmm.
An addendum to that would, I would be.
I knew you'd come up with an addendum. Go on.
Yeah, I would be asking. the data that is held within this sector is not used in public realm decision-making processes. How do we begin to do that?
Agreed.
There's a whole plethora of data that we don't know.
Yeah.
It's the data we don't know, it's out there. How do we start gathering that in to become involved in that? Because, you know, going back to Andy's thing, it's not, you know, it's what we fund, we measure.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, that, again, what I think we have to be, let's start. I'm not saying that we shouldn't create stuff, but there is certainly around just social investment, there's a huge portfolio of open source data that's available. We are responsible for collecting that from all the people we invest into, but that's not perfect, but there's a whole load of information out there. You can manipulate that data using the tools that we have, but you know, we are absolutely supportive of that, and I think there are a whole load of people here that can help you. I'm absolutely with you. We should be speaking for ourselves, and they have a seat at the table so that we can cause headaches for people like Joel. Sorry about that, Joel. Sorry, you're...
Hi, just to add to what Councillor Cotton was saying, USAID project is an example of a public sector investment in the social enterprise sector. Overall, it is about £1 million that went into the capacity of the sector in the city. So absolutely measurable investment into long-term impact, because we understood that it has to be about capacity. It has to be less about public sector putting the responsibility of solving social issues on the social enterprise sector and creating accountability on the other side, like we tend to do with the social impact bonds a lot. So we absolutely wanted to invest into long-term capacity in the sector. And then one of the wonderful things that we're celebrating also during this week is the fact that we managed to support Sarah in establishing Birmingham as a social enterprise city, which is an amazing platform to carry on making impact.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Right. Do we have any more burning questions? If not, I'm going to ask us to wrap up. No? Okay. Right, okay. So, something else I wanted to say about schools. Oh, who was at a Social Enterprise World Forum in Scotland? Just to let you know that if you're in Scotland, Scottish Government pay for support for all schools to understand about social enterprise. How far are we behind? That's something for us to do. And those of you that ever have the opportunity, actually, I got invited. I get invited, it's like next week. The all-parliamentary group in Scottish Government around social enterprise is next week. So, you know, that's a good place for us to take that. I know we've already had one APPG with SCUK on this subject. I think there's definitely a lobbying role for all of us to get more involved in how that happens and learn from their good practice. So let's do that final roundup and summary. I gave you fair warning, did I not, that I was going to come to you all for your one thing that you'll leave the audience with around, one thing that you think around impact investing in place that would make a difference to the growth of Birmingham as a social enterprise city. Where am I going to go? Joel, do you want to go first?
You do that.
You said you can't go, go on.
I think for me it's about understanding that this whole notion of diversity is dead. It's really about inclusion. And so my one action I would say is, how can you become more inclusive with the value that you have? And that's whether it's a commercial, whether you're a social enterprise, whether you're a policymaker, how can you be more inclusive with the value that you have?
Thank you very much. Claire.
I guess bringing it back round again to inclusive growth, I think we have to recognise that we don't have poverty and environmental degradation by accident. And so to kind of come back to your point about let's not look to structural fixes for a cultural problem, I think that even though we have a really strong set of policies, which if I'm going to say about a deliverable, that's what I'm going to go ahead and try and deliver off the back of the work of the Social Economy Task Force, I also realise, and Pauline's comment's a really good example, there is a cultural piece to do too, and actually I've got and we've got as the CA a very big responsibility in how we are leaders of that culture change.
Lovely, thank you. Grace.
So definitely lots that could help, but I'll give an answer from an investor point of view. So I would love to see more individual investors back in social enterprises in the West Midlands, which I guess is one reason why we created the West Midlands Fund. But compared to other regional funds we have, I guess West Midlands is still behind in terms of particularly folks like financial advisors and wealth managers getting their clients to invest for impact. So, very brief example, Bristol, our fund there, about 70% of our investors have come through wealth managers, financial advisors. In West Midlands, it's more like 30%. So I do think West Midlands is a bit behind the curve in terms of like the finance sector really getting this type of stuff. So I'd love them to get it more and ultimately just get more individuals investing for impact, because I think individual investors will then bring investment, but then they also become customers of social enterprises, become advocates, they share it with their friends. I've heard loads of stories where they say, oh, I went to dinner with my friends last night, we talked about social investment the whole night because they'd finally made a social investment. So it does add a...
Friends exciting, aren't they?
Yeah, it was one of our cooler investors who has very strange themed parties. So he was very excited to share his social investment journey. Cool themed parties, not strange. But yeah, basically, there's lots of stories where investors make their first social investment and then they become an advocate for it and they start buying from social enterprise and they talk about it with all their other rich friends that then invest for social impact. So that would be my call to action, I guess, trying to get more financial advisory firms and I guess the gatekeepers to those people to kind of get on board really.
That's going to be a core piece of work that we're going to be doing in our next Get SITR, which is an awareness campaign around trying to help that organisation. And we just published a blog actually from one of the residence investors, Thelma Lovick, and actually she talks about her investment, her passion for Jericho, which was her reason for doing this. Steve, come on, one thing.
Can I actually just have that video of what you've just said there, please? Because at the end of the day, that'll be very relevant to us as well, and extremely relevant to our experiences recently. And Jericho, by the way, in actual fact, was one of our first loans that we did years and years ago. I actually sat there the other night, and people who know that at Price Waterhouse, and there was a mural on the wall, and the mural on the wall says joining together. And basically, at the end of the day, in terms of austerity, with little money around, my one thing would be that at the end of the day, we can all talk about things, but basically, could we actually start to do things together? And therefore, if the public sector And if the public sector came up with a policy guarantee fund to basically say, because nobody this morning has yet mentioned one word, and that is risk. And I hate to say it. Did you mention? No, sorry. I must have been asleep. I apologise, Lady Chairman. Oh, I'm in trouble later. Risk. I took a risk. That's what my life's all about. Risk. It's all about risk. But risk is important, and at the end of the day, the public sector traditionally could put smaller amounts of money in if it's got, and lever up with the help of basically raising awareness, more money for social investment, and therefore give more opportunity to invest in those small businesses and social enterprises that need it in disadvantaged areas, and that's what we're all about. So it's basically joining together.
Thank you, Steve.
The one thing, other than bagging an invite to one of Grace's mates' interesting parties, I've stolen my idea from elsewhere, and I've stolen it from the Use It project because it's something that lived with me at the Use It project session, where the comment was made that as part what's happening up in that part of northwest Birmingham is you've got the massive investment going on with the new hospital, and the observation was made there, if you just took 3% of the spend and invested that into the social economy locally, you'd make a massive difference, a massive sustainable difference. And I think that's exactly the idea that we need to apply right across the piece. So everything that we're doing, whether it's commissioning spend through the council through to the kind of big investments that we're talking about in terms of Commonwealth Games, if we could apply that same approach and invest in a sustainable social economy, the difference that it would make in terms of changing that pattern of inequality in the city would be enormous.
A fantastic place to end. I'm just going to say here on that. So I just wanted to say thank all of the panellists for their contribution. You've been a brilliant audience. Don't normally get you that lively and that excited. We had quite a lot of laughs talking about finance, which is all very good. This is a really important topic. It's not a fundamental thing in terms of all about social investment. It is absolutely not. It is about impact. But in order to scale impact, it requires capital. It requires money to enable us. And that doesn't mean when I say scale that we've all got to be another HS2 or another huge infrastructure organisation. It means that we create impact in our communities for the reasons the reasons that we do business and the reasons that we're in this particular sector. It is really important that you're informed enough, that you're knowledgeable enough, that you do understand the risks and your board understand them. And there's some great work and example out there. It's what our job now is to do, is to bring this to the West Midlands, make sure that our social enterprises and charities are as equipped as possible. Thank you very much.